3 years of marriage, and my husband never touched me. Not even once. And people think that is the strangest sentence a woman can say about her own marriage, but for me, it became my silent reality. The kind of reality that eats you alive slowly, while the world keeps congratulating you on your perfect life. The wedding photos still sit framed in my parents' living room, everyone smiling, everyone proud, everyone saying how lucky I was to marry a man like him. Educated, calm, respected, generous, a man who never raised his voice, who never drank, who never disappeared at night, who paid every bill on time, who showed up to every family event, who prayed, who smiled politely, who opened car doors and carried grocery bags and never once laid a finger on me. Not in anger, not in desire, not in love, not even by accident, not even in sleep. And in the beginning, I told myself it was patience. I told myself it was respect. I told myself he was shy. I told myself he was different. I told myself love does not have to look like what movies show us. And I repeated those lies so often they began to sound like truth, especially when everyone around me reinforced them. My mother would say, "At least he doesn't hit you." My aunt would say, "At least he doesn't cheat." My friends would say, "You're lucky. Men only want one thing, and here you are with a man who wants your soul." And I would smile, nod, agree. Because how do you explain emptiness when nothing looks wrong from the outside? How do you complain when there are no bruises, no scandals, no late-night phone calls? How do you tell people that your husband sleeps next to you every night like a stranger, carefully leaving space between your bodies like an invisible wall exists? And the first year passed like that, quietly, painfully, with hope. I would try wearing silk at night. I would try cooking his favorite meals. I would try perfume. I would try silence. I would try conversation. I would try prayers. I would try patience. I would try distance. Nothing changed. He would kiss my forehead before sleep like a brother would. He would turn to his side and sleep, and I would stare at the ceiling, counting the seconds until morning, wondering what kind of wife measures love in inches of mattress space. The second year, something inside me began to break. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in small, quiet ways. I stopped looking in mirrors. I stopped buying clothes. I stopped laughing freely. I stopped imagining children, because how do children come from a marriage like this? And every time I tried to talk to him, he would gently shut it down with the same calm voice, saying, "Not now, not tonight, we'll talk later." And later never came. And the thing about unanswered questions is they grow teeth. They start biting at your sanity. And by the third year, I was no longer confused. I was humiliated. Because deep down, I knew something was wrong, and everyone else seemed blind, or worse, uninterested. And then came the night that changed everything. The night I stopped being a patient wife and became a woman desperate for truth. It was raining outside, one of those nights where the sky feels as heavy as your chest. He came home late, which was rare, and his shirt smelled like hospital disinfectant. Not perfume, not alcohol, disinfectant. And when I asked, he said he had visited a friend who was sick, but his eyes avoided mine, just for a second, just long enough to plant a seed of suspicion that finally grew roots. And that night, after he fell asleep, I did something I never thought I would do. I went through his things, quietly, carefully, like I was committing a crime against my own marriage. And I found nothing at first. No messages, no pictures, no second phone, no secret accounts, just neat folders and clean emails. And for a moment, I felt stupid, ashamed, dramatic, until I noticed a locked drawer in his study, a drawer I had never seen him open. And my hands were shaking as I tried keys, one by one, until one worked. And what I found inside did not scream infidelity. It whispered something far worse. Medical files, sealed envelopes, prescription records, psychological evaluations, appointment slips dating back years before we met, and my name was nowhere on them, which told me everything had been hidden deliberately. And as I sat on the floor reading words I barely understood, diagnoses, timelines, notes written by strangers about the man I slept beside every night, I realized my marriage was never built on truth. And the reason he never touched me was not what people would assume. Not another woman, not religion, not morality, but something darker, something planned, something that started long before I ever said I do. And the worst part was realizing I had not been chosen as a wife, but selected for a role. And that realization was only the beginning, because once I confronted him, the story he told shattered everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and the kind of betrayal that wears a wedding ring and smiles at family dinners. And as dawn broke that morning, I understood one terrifying truth. My husband had never withheld himself from me by accident. He had done it by design, and the reason would change my life forever. When I confronted him, it was not dramatic. There was no screaming, no throwing things, no tears at first, because shock has a way of freezing emotion into something cold and sharp. I placed the files on the table one by one, like evidence in a courtroom, and waited for him to deny them, to laugh, to accuse me of invading his privacy. But he didn't do any of that. He just sat down, slowly, like a man who had been waiting years for this moment, and for the first time since I met him, his calm cracked, not into anger, but into exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying a secret too heavy for one person. And he said my name, the way people say goodbye, and told me there were things about his life that were decided before he ever met me, and that our marriage was never supposed to look like other marriages. And when I asked, why me? Why drag me into something I never agreed to? He said, because you were kind, because you were quiet, because you came from a family that values patience and sacrifice, because you wouldn't question things loudly. And hearing that felt like being peeled open layer by layer, because I realized he hadn't loved me, he had studied me. And then he told me the truth, or at least the version he wanted me to hear. He said years ago, before we met, he had been diagnosed with a condition, not one that made him incapable of intimacy, but one that made it dangerous for him psychologically, emotionally. He said he had violent, intrusive thoughts tied to physical closeness, thoughts he never acted on, thoughts that terrified him so much he swore to himself he would never touch a woman in that way. And when his family pushed him to marry, he agreed, under one condition, that it would be a marriage of companionship only, and that the woman would never know because they believed telling her would scare her away. And I listened to this explanation with my heart pounding, because even though it sounded tragic, it didn't explain the lies, the planning, the deception. And when I asked why therapy notes mentioned long-term observation and legal language, his face went pale. And that was when the story shifted, and the air in the room felt heavy, like something poisonous had been released. And he admitted there was more, that the condition was connected to an incident that never went to court, an incident his family buried with money, influence, and silence, an incident involving another woman who trusted him and survived, but never spoke publicly. And suddenly, I couldn't breathe, because I realized my untouched body was not a sign of restraint, but a safety measure. And the marriage was not protection for me, it was protection for him. A clean image, a respectable cover, a life that looked stable enough to convince doctors, courts, and family that he was cured, managed, safe. And as he spoke, I saw every moment of our marriage differently. Every polite gesture, every distance, every excuse, every night he turned away was not rejection, it was containment. And the betrayal hit me in waves, because consent means nothing when truth is withheld, and my entire adult life had been shaped around a lie that benefited everyone but me. And when I asked him why he never told me, why he never gave me a choice, he said, "Because you would have left." And the way he said it, so matter of fact, like my right to leave was an inconvenience, shattered whatever sympathy I had left. And that was when anger finally arrived, hot and uncontrollable, because 3 years of my youth, my hope, my body, my future had been stolen quietly, legally, socially. And the worst part was knowing if I spoke up, if I told anyone the truth, I would be painted as the ungrateful wife, the dramatic woman, the one who couldn't handle a good man. And he knew that because his family had already rehearsed the narrative. And as if to prove it, his phone rang, his mother calling, asking if everything was okay, asking if I had seen the doctor reports yet, and smiling through her voice like this was all part of a controlled release of information. And that night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the couch watching a man I no longer recognized breathe peacefully in the bedroom while my mind raced through memories connecting dots I had ignored. And by morning, I understood something even more terrifying. The reason he never touched me was not just fear or control. It was because touching me would have made me a witness. And untouched, I was only a prop. And props are easier to silence. And that realization changed my grief into resolve, because betrayal like this doesn't end with tears, it ends with strategy. And as I began quietly planning my next move, I had no idea the truth went even deeper, and that the final revelation would come not from him, but from the woman's life he had almost destroyed before me, and who had been waiting patiently for the right moment to speak. I didn't leave the house the next morning, not because I was afraid, but because I understood something fundamental about traps. Once you realize you're inside one, you don't run blindly, you study the structure. And I began doing exactly that, quietly, carefully, like a woman who had learned the cost of noise. I smiled when his mother called again. I nodded when he asked if I was okay. I cooked dinner. I listened. I observed. And in those days, something shifted inside me. Grief turned into clarity, and clarity is sharpened into purpose. Because the more I replayed his confession, the more I realized how rehearsed it was, how many lines were designed to soften my reaction, how many parts were missing. And then the message arrived. Not dramatically, not threateningly, just a simple email from an unknown address with one sentence that stopped my heart. "I know why he never touched you, and I can prove it." And for a moment, my hands shook, not from fear, but recognition, because some truths recognize each other before the mind catches up, and I replied with a single word: how? And the response came quickly, too quickly, like someone who had been waiting years for permission to speak. We met 2 days later in a quiet cafe across town. She sat facing the window, sunglasses on, posture stiff, like someone trained to scan exits. And when she finally removed them, I saw not madness, not bitterness, but exhaustion, the kind that comes from surviving something no one believes. And she didn't waste time. She told me she was the incident he mentioned, but not the version he told me. Not violent thoughts, not loss of control, but deliberate manipulation. She said he enjoyed power, enjoyed proximity without accountability, enjoyed knowing he could cross lines slowly without consequences. And when she finally realized what was happening and tried to speak, his family intervened immediately. Doctors, lawyers, character witnesses appeared overnight, and the narrative was rewritten. She was unstable, emotional, confused, and he was the calm, promising man seeking treatment. And when I asked why she stayed silent all these years, she said because silence was safer until it wasn't. And she slid a folder across the table, thicker than the one I found in his drawer, containing recordings, messages, evaluations, emails from doctors who questioned his progress, documents showing the marriage recommendation not as treatment, but as proof of normalcy, a controlled environment where he could demonstrate restraint and growth. And suddenly, I understood the cruelty of it all. I was not chosen because I was safe. I was chosen because I was useful, because a woman who stayed untouched for years without complaint was the ultimate evidence that he had changed. And my marriage was not just a lie, it was a clinical exhibit. And when I asked her why she was coming forward now, she looked at me and said, because you survived without even knowing what you were surviving, and because they are preparing him for something bigger, something public, something that requires a flawless image. And that was when the final piece clicked into place. His recent absences, the disinfectant smell, the hospital visits, he wasn't supporting a friend, he was being evaluated, cleared, prepared, and the marriage was entering its final stage. And I went home that day with a calm I had never felt before, because knowledge removes fear and replaces it with options. And for the first time in 3 years, I slept not beside him, but away from him, mentally, emotionally, planning every move. And when he asked me days later if I wanted to start trying for a child, I realized how close I had come to being trapped forever, because a child would not be a miracle, it would be a seal. And I smiled and said I needed time, and he accepted that too easily. And that was when I knew he still underestimated me, and underestimated women like us, who learn quietly and strike precisely. And as I began preparing evidence, timelines, backups, legal counsel, I understood the ending of the story would not be loud, it would be undeniable. And when the moment came, and it would come soon, the question would no longer be why he never touched me, but how he thought he would get away with it again. By the time everything collapsed, it did not feel sudden to me, only to everyone else, because endings always look like accidents to those who weren't paying attention, and I had been paying attention for 3 years. I moved through the house like a ghost, polite, agreeable, observant, backing up files, forwarding emails, recording conversations, saving appointment schedules, taking photographs of documents he thought were buried too deep to ever surface. And the strange thing was how easy it was, because men who believe they are protected grow careless, and families who believe they own narratives stop guarding them. And when the opportunity finally arrived, it came disguised as celebration, a public recognition event, a panel discussion on rehabilitation reform where he was to be presented as a success story, a model of recovery, a man trusted enough to advise policy. And as I stood beside him that evening, smiling for cameras, wearing the same ring that had never symbolized love, I felt no hatred, only precision. Because justice does not need rage, it needs timing. And when the moderator asked me to say a few words as the supportive wife, I stepped forward calmly and spoke truth without emotion, without accusation, without drama. I spoke about silence, about consent, about how restraint is not recovery when it is forced. And I spoke carefully, slowly enough for the room to settle into confusion before discomfort. And when I introduced the woman sitting in the audience, the one whose life had been nearly erased, the room froze. Because lies depend on isolation, and truth multiplies when witnesses meet, and documents followed, recordings played, timelines aligned, doctors contradicted each other publicly, legal language collapsed under plain facts. And in that moment, the image they spent years building disintegrated, not because I screamed, but because I didn't. And the aftermath was quiet. Court filings, resignations, investigations, statements, carefully worded apologies that admitted nothing and protected no one. And when the marriage was finally dissolved, it felt less like a divorce and more like the return of stolen time. And people asked me later how I survived 3 years untouched, how I stayed, how I didn't see it sooner. And I told them the truth, because the truth deserves daylight. Sometimes harm doesn't look like violence. Sometimes it looks like politeness, structure, respectability. Sometimes the cage is clean and well-furnished, and you don't realize you're trapped until you stop blaming yourself for the missing air. And I didn't win because he fell. I won because I stood up whole, informed, unashamed, and walked away carrying my name, my body, my future back into my own hands. And if there is a lesson, it is this. Love never requires silence, and patience is not a virtue when it is demanded through deception. And 3 years of being untouched taught me more about power than a lifetime of being held ever could.